So let me tell you about a problem that I have at my home. That my home is basically being taken over by books because I buy books about 10 times. Well, since I've had kids, I think I used to buy books about 5 times faster than I read them. I now buy books between 10 and 20 times faster than I read them. And then even when I decide that I want to read more, the act of reading exponentially increases the number of books that I buy. And then I've kind of moved away from buying Kindle books because if I buy Kindle books, I forget about them. Whereas if I buy a paperback book, it's there sitting on the shelf. It's looking at me saying, it's there reminding me. So what I tend to do now is the book comes through. I'll sometimes scan it. I'll like give it a sniff because I'm weird like that. I'll read the start, I'll read the ending, and then I'll shelve it for later. And I'd say I'll read most of them. But I think there's something in it for me where it's like a book. There is something about books that kind of conveys authority. And I think if you go back to the stem of author being tied to authority, like that, I think carries a lot of weight for me. So I keep coming back to books. And I think Daniel Priestley talks about this in Key Person of Influence. And he says that, if you want to be the authority in your niche, then you really need to have a book. So having said all that, so this is what, for anyone listening, we're talking to Vicky Fraser today. And Vicky is a book coach. And I don't know, I guess as this is the Story Copywriter podcast, perhaps you could talk through for anyone listening, a slice of your story and how you got into your business as it is today.
Yeah, there are so many things I could say about this. Thank you for having me on for a start. Literally everything you just said, I'm like, you're the boy version of me because I have so many books. And before we even start, I'm actually going to recommend to you this beautiful little book, which is great for radio. It's called On Reading by Nick Parker. Yes. And he talks about his problem that we share, which is like too many books. And basically don't worry about it and just keep buying books and then read them however you fancy. But anyway, that's not what you asked me. So
my wife, Lindsay, she literally rolls her eyes every time a new book comes in. But, she likes it to be all tidy and to every book actually be on the bookshelf, not just in a pile on top of or next to the bookshelf, which is now where they are.
Oh my God, that drives my husband nuts as well. He's like, could you stop with the horizontal filing? And why are there now new piles of books? And it's just like, and so I have that, like I have just stuff everywhere, but also I get really stressed out when it's messy. So my life is very stressful. But anyway, you asked where I came from. So yeah, hi, I'm Vicky. I'm a book coach and a writing coach. And I started off as a copywriter, much like your good self, until one day somebody said, can you write me a book? Can you guys write me a book? And in my head, I was just like, I have no idea how to do that. And out of my mouth came, yes, absolutely. And so I wrote my first book for somebody.
I'm a recovering people pleaser as well. So
yeah, it was partly people pleasing and partly just like, you know what? I've always wanted to do this, so I'm just going to give it a go. And so I was like, I'm going to have to learn how to do this. And I've still got that book and I'm really proud of it. And it's very, I would say it's amateurish because it's not, but it's not what I would do now, let's put it that way. And I loved it so much. I was like, this is fantastic. I wonder if I can write my own book. And so I did. And I obviously did a lot of kind of reading around. How do I do this? How do I do this? And there's some great stuff out there. Like there's some really great books on writing, loads of really great books on writing. There's some really great books on how to write books, but there wasn't quite what I needed. And so I was like, I'm going to write my own book about how to write a book. And that actually wasn't my first book. I wrote a different book, which is my first book, but my kind of book that I hang my business off now, I wrote because it was the book that I wanted to read. And so that kind of got me started off on coaching people because people gradually started coming to me. It's like, oh, can you help me write a book? And I was like, yes, I probably can. And so that's what I do now. I love it. I love helping people get their stories out into the world and getting their books out into the world.
If no one else has written the book that you want to read, then maybe that's a sign that you need to write it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think I was talking to somebody else the other day, and he was asking about, reader personas and stuff. And you can do all of that, like marketing avatar stuff and, blah, 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 whatever. But honestly, I think if you have an idea that you can't see anywhere else and you would like to know more about it, then don't wait for somebody else to do it. Like write it yourself. There's no reason why not. And you then get to kind of write about it from your experience and your point of view. And you're not like nobody is a special snowflake, however much we like to think. So there is always going to be other people out there who are similar enough that they will want your perspective on things. And so, yeah, write the book that you want to read.
Yeah, I think people are both more similar and more different to us than we realize. So on a sort of, we kind of assume that people share more of our opinions and biases and perspectives and whatnot, whereas actually they don't. However, when you do something that really just is kind of, you think it's unique to you, like I remember I used to run from Sheffield city centre home in the middle of winter, and I was like, surely I am the only person in Sheffield that does this. And then one day I ran past another runner who was also running up this massive hill in about 2-degree snow almost. And like, we looked at each other, it's like, there's another nutter that thinks this is a good idea. It's like, well, actually, there's more people who are similar to you than you realize, but we're also more different.
Yeah, definitely. And I love that as well, because I love it when I see somebody who, like, they just do something. Like yesterday, for example, I was teaching I teach trapeze in my spare time, and I was doing the warm-up, and I suddenly noticed the girl in front of me was wearing a Buffy the Vampire Slayer t-shirt, and she was probably half my age, but so she would not have watched it first time round, but I was just like, teacher, and it's like a little moment of delight, like, oh, there is a person who at least one thing we've got in common, and it's quite a nerdy thing, and so, you know, I could have a conversation with that person about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and I love that, those moments of recognition and connection.
I always thought I was the only barefoot runner in Sheffield, and then actually I realised that we're actually quite a common breed. There's quite a lot of us.
Well, that's like the confirmation bias, isn't it? You see one and then they're everywhere.
Yeah. Is coaching and teaching like an input? So you're a trapeze coach, you're also a book coach, and you kind of moved into coaching instead of doing client work and doing the copywriting. Is that something that's also quite important to you?
Yeah, it really is, because I realize that as much as I love creating my own stuff, and I write my own books and I write my own essays, I'm doing an MA in creative writing, so I'm doing all of that, but like, and I love performing on trapeze as well. But what I really love as well, at least as much, is seeing people have breakthroughs. And so in trapeze is a really like easy like visual for people. It's like people struggling with a move, like it's like, oh, I want to do this move, I want to do this move, and you're like, oh, try this tweak, try that tweak, and then suddenly you come up with something and they just get it like that, and you see them suddenly be able to do something that they couldn't do before. It's such a great feeling. Like, it's a great feeling for them, but for me it's like, oh, I helped them do that. That's very cool. And it's the same with book coaching and writing coaching. It's like people will be like, oh, you know, I'm not sure I can do this. And like, for example, I was working with somebody who has been trying to write his book for, he said, like 3.5 years, and he booked a VIP day with me. And by the end of it, like, and that was like in November, and he has finished his first draft now. And so I was just like, that is so
like cool. Doing trapeze though, for someone who isn't a writer, like, I think writing a book is, well, it is a big thing, and maybe we can get into that in a sec, but like, for someone who isn't a writer, like, that is like doing trapeze, and all of a sudden they're doing trapeze. Yeah,
definitely. And, you know, a lot of people, they think, I mean, writers write, and that is as simple as that. But like, a lot of people, and I know it's easy to say that because a lot of people come to me and they're like, oh, I'm not a writer, but I really want to write a book. And so like, one of my jobs is not so much to get the book written, that's fairly obvious, but it's like, it's helping them to switch that mindset of like, this is a person that I can become, this is a person that I am, and this is a thing that I can do, and kind of changing them from, you know, seeing that transformation of I'm not a writer to, oh my god, I'm a writer, I'm doing it, is very, very cool, and it opens a lot of doors for other stuff as well.
Yes, I think every time I talk to clients about writing a book, there's a few things that they push back on. One is that they think firstly, they think they don't have anything interesting to say, which is obviously false. They think that their story is boring or routine, which is obviously false. They think it's too much work, too much time, which may be true. So the thing that triggered this conversation was you put up a post on LinkedIn about MicroBooks, and more specifically about mighty MicroBooks. And I wondered if you could talk through what that means.
Yeah, so I am sure that you, like me, have read books that could have been a blog post. And I actually think this comes from the traditional publishing rules. It's like, oh, you know, a novel has to be like 100,000 words, and a non-fiction book has to be 60 to 80,000 words. And my question is why? Like, why? Because sometimes I think authors, and I don't even blame the authors most of the time, it's like they've got this publishing deal and they're publisher is expecting 80,000 words. And so they're like, crap, I've got this idea. How am I going to fill this book? And so it ends up being filled with fluff and filler. And if you're a certain type of writer or marketer, it just becomes an extended sales letter that is actually of limited value for the reader. And that really pisses me off, to be honest, because I think it's disrespectful to the reader. It's like, for me, a book can be an incredibly useful marketing tool and incredibly useful, but it shouldn't be an extended sales letter, you know? It's like, if somebody is committing to reading a book, that's actually a really respectful thing to do, and I don't want to abuse their time by spending the whole thing
investing their time and therefore their life into paying attention to you, and you're wasting that time by filler because you're trying to adhere to what you perceive is the kind of done thing for the medium. Exactly.
And some of it is because you're trying to adhere to the done thing for the medium. Some of it is because you're literally contracted to write that many words, and you know, that's a different problem. But some of it is, you know, literally that people have heard, and I've heard people say this. So, it doesn't matter it doesn't matter if your book's crap and nobody reads it, you just need to have a book. And that's another thing that gives me the rage. And it's like, no, it's a waste of trees. It's a waste of everybody's time. And it's like, if you're going to write a book, even a crap book is a difficult thing to do. So like, why not just do the difficult thing and make it a good book? And so that was kind of what got me thinking about, you know, I'd read this, actually, it wasn't even a bad book that I'd read. It was, and because this is no shade on Mike Michalowicz at all. He wrote Profit First. It's a great book, but the vast majority of that book is not for me, because I am not a numbers person, and I'm like, it just sounds like blah, blah, blah.
You just need a big idea of having a few different accounts and paying yourself first and moving money into the tax accounts and to the profit accounts. And that's basically it.
Literally changed my life, since
I
implemented that. Yeah, like I've never had to worry about money again since I implemented that. I realized that's a very privileged thing to say, but because like all of the rest of it, I was bad with money and now I'm not. And so if he had like, I'm not saying that the rest of his book was fluff and filler, but if he turned the first 3 chapters into a micro book, I'd be all over that. And I bet a lot of other people would as well. So that's an extra book for him if he wanted it.
He's got a very compelling story at the outset of that, where his 5-year-old comes up to him with a piggy bank. And I forgot the gist of the story now, which is a shame. But yeah, he's got a very compelling story about his daughter coming up to him and having multiple piggy banks for like her savings, and this is for this and this is for this, and he realizes, well, maybe I should just run my business like this as well.
Yeah, that's really cool, and that's the kind of story that is perfect to lead into any kind of a book, you know, but particularly a micro book. So yeah, that was what I was thinking, that was the thing that I thought, oh, that could have been a tiny book and I would have read the whole thing, because I've not read the rest of his book, and it's not his fault, it's my fault, I'm just not interested in it. But yeah, I had thought, you know, what other ideas could be, you know, tiny little ideas. And so George Orwell's Politics and the English Language, which I was writing about today, was another one. And it's like, I mean, technically, I think back in the day, that would have been a blog post, right? But he didn't have blogs back then. So he published it as a pamphlet, and he had all sorts of other ideas. I've got a book called, am I allowed to swear on your podcast?
Yeah.
I've got a little book called Fucking Apostrophes, which I love, and it's like a grammar book, but it's literally just about apostrophes, and it's quite sweary, and it's like, once you've read that, you know how to use apostrophes, and you also know that there aren't really any fixed rules, grammar changes and all the rest of it. So that was a perfectly tiny idea. This book that I was just talking about on reading is Nick Parker's thoughts on provocations, consolations, and suggestions for reading more freely. And it's just his thoughts on reading. It's not a how-to, it's like a little book of thoughts. And again, it's perfect. It's like, so I think the micro book medium is really flexible. You can do a lot with it. It can be like one of George Orwell's micro books, like on, you know, he would have called them pamphlets, but it was like a few thoughts on toads. And I was like, that's so cool. Cigarettes versus books. And I'm like, I don't see how that could even be a comparison. So now I desperately want to read that, because it's like, you know, just little musings of whatever. Or it could be like one of my microbook clients wrote a book on procrastination, but it wasn't, no, perfectionism, sorry. But it wasn't like a massive deep thing. It was like, here are 3 or 4 tools that you can actually physically do. She took an abstract concept, which was perfectionism, and put it into your body. So it's like, breathing, are you breathing properly? It's like the anxiety aspect of it, and she turned it into a tangible thing in the space of like 80 pages, and that's another little tiny book that changed my life. And so I just think it can be, that's what I mean by mighty, coming back to your question,
because it actually delivers a tangible outcome by almost taking, so let's take perfectionism as an example. That's a big topic that if you were to tackle in a single book would require quite a large word counts. but by kind of niching down within that and addressing one specific thing that is easy for the reader to implement or take action on or put into practice, you're providing a mighty outcome.
Yeah, and I like to describe it as like a transformation. So quite often I'm finding when I work with people to write their microbooks, they start off with too big an idea, right? It's too broad and it starts to become really bloaty. And that's not to say that a big book on the subject wouldn't be great, because I reckon that Joanna might go on to write like a big book on perfectionism at some point. But like my thinking is, okay, what do the people need to know before that? Okay, what do they need to know before that? It's like before, so if you're trying to teach somebody something, if they're not in like the right mind frame to learn it, there's no point, right? So for somebody to understand more about what they need to do for, say, perfectionism, it's like maybe the best first step is for them to understand how it sits and feels in their body and what they can then do. Because once you understand what it is, instead of it being an abstract idea, you can then start to do more stuff. And so we've found that with a couple of other people. So like my friend Yinka, who you've probably seen around on LinkedIn, she's writing a microbook on cash, and like everybody thinks they know what cash is and cash flow is, but actually most people don't. And so we think about sales, we think about income, we think about all that stuff, but without cash flow and an understanding of that, the rest of it doesn't matter, because you don't have a business without cash flow. And so she's ramped it right back to the beginning. It's like, what do people need to understand before they can do anything else?
She's taken the problem back to first principles, and after addressing the problem from first principles, you could build on that from there. Maybe with a series of books,
maybe, but yeah, I mean, I know that she's writing,
or a bigger book that follows. If people like the micro book, maybe they'll like the macro book.
Exactly, yeah. And that's a thing that people can do as well. It's like, write a series of microbooks and then maybe they become chapters in a macrobook even. But like my key thing for microbooks and for any book, like even fiction books, is like, what's the transformation? It's not just writing for the sake of it. It's like, in a fiction book, you're looking for the transformation of the protagonist, I guess. How do they change over time? And in the non-fiction book, it's like, how do you want the reader to change over time? If I read a book, I'm not just like subconsciously, I'm not, I'm just reading it. Like consciously, it's like, I just want to read this because it's interesting. But subconsciously, I'm always looking for that transformation. So like, how am I going to see the world differently after I finish reading this book? Or, is my mind going to be changed? Am I going to learn something that shifts my worldview a little bit? And most people don't think about that consciously, but I think that's what most of us want when we read a book. It's like, we want that transformation, because otherwise, what's the point?
Do you think people who are writing a micro book maybe need to kind of really niche down on a particular audience a lot more to focus that in? Because maybe you only want to focus on the person who's actually going to be able to achieve that transformation, or has the problem that is the starting point that's going to enable that kind of arc, that kind of character arc to happen.
I think so, yeah. And I'm going to use Profit First as another example of that. So I'm not his ideal audience. I'm not interested in the numbers and the figures, rightly or wrongly. I'm just not going to do it. And so if he was thinking of turning the first chapters into a microbook, then someone like me would be his perfect person. I was like, not interested in the finance side of things, just not. But I still have this need to understand how to go from being a person who scrabbles for their taxes every month to to the other way around. And so like I think in that case he's got this audience, and he pitched his book perfectly to his audience. It just happens that I read the first bit, but if he was looking to create different books for different audiences, then he would look at, okay, well, who is reading just the first 3 chapters of that book? People like me. Who is reading the like nerdy boring stuff about spreadsheets? Maybe that could be a microbook, or maybe that's who he aims his whole book at. So I would say thinking about, for people who are listening to your podcast, thinking about what kind of a microbook they might want to write is like, a microbook is a tiny entry-level product for people. So maybe the best way to approach that would be, what do people need to know before they start working with me? Or what do they need to know before they might want to be interested in buying my my next price product or whatever? So that's probably a good way of looking at it, is like, you don't necessarily want to put a lot of time and effort into educating people, putting courses together for people, or putting products together for people who are further down the road. But it's a really nice way to bring new people into your world without too much. Well, I mean, once it's written, it's like, you don't have to write it and rewrite it. So does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So you can bring people in, you can tell some of your story, you can establish trust without going into the details. And maybe there's an option at the end for people who want to come into the details to take the next step, whether that's a bigger book, whether that's a course, whether that's working with you one-on-one, however that looks.
Yeah.
It's funny listening to this, it's kind of giving me ideas for I have a nagging feeling about my simple story selling book, which is evolved into a sort of fairly big book. It's almost like 300 pages long, but it's actually like not everyone needs to read all of that. Like there's quite a lot of stuff in there. Like not everyone needs to know the 7 steps to write a decent story. Like if you're not actually going to write your own emails, you probably don't need to read that part of the book.
Yeah.
Not everyone needs to know about Christopher Booker's 7 basic plots and how they can be applied into business. It's something that I could actually split off into separate books.
Yeah.
And I've known this sort of I've known this for a while, but kind of suppressed it because it's like I've kind of already done the work. Would you consider like taking an existing body of work like that and kind of splitting out certain topics?
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. And there's a couple of reasons for that, partly for the reasons that we've just talked about with like bringing people in at different levels, but also because like, and I'll use my book as an example here. How the hell do you write a book? That's quite chunky as well. It's a big book, and it takes you through literally everything you need to know. Some people are going to love that. They're going to dive in and they're going to be like, oh, this is great. Other people, and sometimes I am people, is like, that's too much. Like it's just overwhelming. And so if you give them those bite-sized pieces, because it's really easy to say, I'll just read it one chapter at a time, but our brains do not work like that. We see a big thing and it's scary. So that's another reason to do it. If you're like, we don't have to appeal to everybody all the time, but I do think that we try and teach too much because we've been sold this idea that value is more. Like it's always more. It's more information, more of this. You've got to like pile more stuff on. But if I see a product that I want and they pile loads and loads and loads and loads of bonuses on, I often walk in the other direction because I'm like, that is too much. I know that I'm not going to use all of those bonuses. I just want to learn this one thing. And so if their bonus is a one-to-one call with them, that's awesome, because that's like, okay, cool, I can do the thing and then I can have a chat. But if the bonus is like, oh, and you get these 53 courses as well, I'm like, absolutely not. That's
no, it's
too much. It's too much for me. And so that kind of thinking was another one of the reasons why I got thinking about MicroBooks. It's like, how can we simplify this for people? I don't think it's about attention spans, because our attention spans haven't changed. Like brains don't change that quickly. But I do think that we're busier. We're more stressed and all the rest of it. And so if we can make it simpler for people, it's like, teach them one thing, like give them one idea to chew on, and then maybe they'll be ready for the next idea and the next idea. And some people like to do that sequentially in big books, but many of us don't. And like, even if you're dipping a toe in, so like I'm learning to knit at the moment. That's
such a grandma activity, I'm afraid to say.
Well, I don't know. My friend Ed, who is also a trapeze teacher, he knits. He is definitely not grandma-ish. Okay. And Tom Daly. Hey, yep. Tom Daly knits. Anyway, but I was like, I could
be very wrong.
I want to learn to knit. And so, but I'm so far at the beginning of my journey that I'm not even in book territory yet. So I'm in YouTube territory. And so if somebody
this is what we're doing, because YouTube is a problem solution environment. And actually what you're doing with a MicroBook is solving one problem. And that means that you can almost like, if you were to think about it from an SEO or keyword sense, it's like each book can cater more specifically to a particular problem, even to a particular search query or to a particular route in. And it kind of gives you much greater coverage like that, because that's what you would do if you were implementing a YouTube strategy.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I just think that, yeah, exactly what you've just said, and for people, because I will help people write those books, and I do help people write those books. And I also help people write books who are like, oh, I've just like the on reading book. It's like, it's not really like, kind of is solving a problem, but not like overtly. It's just like, here are some thoughts of mine on how I read books. And it's like, that's really interesting. I'm doing a similar thing with a MicroBook that I'm writing at the moment, about, well, it's for writers with ADHD, and it's not a how-to book, it's not an instruction book, but it's just like, here are some thoughts, here are some things that I've learned, here are some little stories, and I hope that people get something out of it. And it doesn't have to be overt, it doesn't have to, but it's going to be another way for people to get to know me and who I am. And so there isn't, there are formulas and there are templates and things that I work with people to use, but also there is a space for people to just go, I'm just going to fling a bunch of thoughts down, turn it into a MicroBook and pop it out there. And like I say, fling, it'll be edited and it'll be a good book and all the rest of it.
There's more work that goes into it than just flinging it together. But yeah.
But it can start like that, it doesn't have to start with a framework and a strategy and a kind of, all-encompassing business plan. It can just start with, I've got this cool idea, and I think other people might be quite interested in it.
I think the appealing thing as well is, like, if you're writing shorter books, you can publish them a lot faster, you can get feedback on them a lot faster, you can start getting Amazon reviews and everything else a lot faster, which kind of snowballs into this kind of cumulative effect.
Yes.
How long? Okay, so there's a few questions. So if someone's thinking about this, like, how long realistic, typically might a microbook be? And how long would you say, for someone who isn't a writer, how long should it take to write one?
Okay, so I think of microbooks as being sub 100 pages, so less than 100 pages. George Orwell's Politics in the English Language is 24 pages. A couple of the ones that I'm helping to usher through at the moment are between 40 and 80 pages. So sub 100 pages, maybe 10, 12,000 words. But honestly, it's kind of up to you. So that's the kind of length. How long it takes to write really depends on how much time you've got. But my microbook course is 4 weeks. So I'm aiming for people to have that first draft done and maybe some editing done within that 4 weeks. And then I've had people get it, up and published within 6 to 8 weeks. So it can be that quick.
Do you ever have people who kind of record the content verbally first and then convert that into written rather than sitting at the keyboard because it terrifies them?
Absolutely. And I tell people to do that as well. So if somebody is really struggling, like I have a client who speaks all of her books into her voice notes while she's pacing around and walking around and stuff. I have other clients who freeze when they sit in front of a keyboard. And so like writing doesn't mean necessarily sitting in front of a keyboard or a piece of paper and writing words on paper. It's like, it's thinking in a way that is recorded. So if that's like, if you're recording it with words, that's fine. But yeah, I'm all about, if you are finding yourself stuck, imagine that you are having imagine that we are like, I could take this conversation that we're having and turn that into a microbook, because
get the transcripts and
get the transcripts, because it's going to be a really natural way to do it. Because I think a lot of the time people will sit down and they're like, I have to write a book, and it becomes this thing, and it's like, I'm not a writer, how do I do this? Whereas if they imagine that they are having a conversation with a friend or somebody who's asking them questions about their topic, that can become a really natural way of doing it, because they are not fettered then by this idea, by this pressure of like being a writer. It's like, I just need to talk passionately about the thing that I care about for 20 minutes.
Would they need to kind of dictate it, like just imagine the conversation, or would they be better doing it in dialogue? Or does the kind of dialogue make it harder to subsequently edit into a book?
I mean, it would depend on, I would say it would depend on who's writing and kind of what their aims are. But like, I like the idea, like I've read some really good books that are dialogue. I mean, didn't Plato write his dialogues?
Yeah, I think so.
Way back when.
It's not a new idea, is it?
It's not a new idea, no. And so that can work really well because it's quite an engaging way of doing things. But so it depends on what kind of book you want to write. But I would say, some people find it really useful to write themselves out a series of interview questions and then answer them. Some people find it really useful to get their partner or a friend or a colleague or whatever to kind of interview them almost. People going on podcasts, like I would, if people have got an idea, they're talking about it, they've done a lot of podcast interviews, just get the transcripts from those podcasts and start with that. That's a really good place to start, because podcast interviewers are generally really good at pulling not just like information out, but pulling that expertise out as well. It's like, I always feel a massive confidence boost after I've done a podcast, because you sit there and you think, actually, I know a lot more than I think I do. And it's done in a natural way. And so I'm a really big fan of people doing that when they're coming to write their book. It's like, get someone to interview you, because one of the things that gets in the way is that feeling of, oh, do I actually know enough to write a book? And it's like, yeah, you do. You absolutely do. It's just that we forget how much we know when somebody doesn't ask us about it. So I think that can be a really powerful thing to do.
This is like 90% of what I do, is just interviewing people who think they haven't got an interesting message, but actually when you interview them, you ask a few questions and then the floodgates open. And then I take the raw material of that and then pick out kind of seams of coal, if you like, or gold, and try to find the veins that are obvious to me, because I'm a step removed from them, so it's a bit more obvious to see. Every time, I think what's maybe interesting is that I find it much easier to do this for clients than I do to do for myself, because I guess I'm just too close to my own thoughts, my own work, maybe. Yeah,
everybody does. Everybody finds it more difficult to, I think I find it much easier to write about myself now than I did, because I've practiced a lot. And a lot of the stuff that I'm doing for my MA is like personal essays and things. So I'm like, oh, what could I write about today? I'll write about my weird habits for eating cheese. And I actually just did that for an assignment. So, but it was like that is a way of writing about yourself as well. It's like, it doesn't always have to be, the kind of the bio, the elevator pitch, whatever it is. Just like, write about your quirks and kind of start getting used to that. But I love what you said about kind of being too close to it, because I think people do, it's like you are too close to it. It's like your life is mundane because it's your life and it's every day. Like I had a client who has had literally the craziest life. Drayton Bird, 2 separate women tried to stab him, and he's just like, oh, my life's really boring. And I'm like, dude. And so even he thinks his life is boring because he lives it every day. And so that's why I think it's really useful for somebody like you to come along and pull those stories out of people.
I think though, even if you do end up talking monologue and kind of dictating it, like it does get easier the more you do it. Like the first 40 odd episodes of this podcast were me talking monologue, and I started it because I felt I had various things in my head that I wanted to say that was going to take quite a long time to write, and I felt there was more value in just talking through it. And like the first episode, I had to do so much editing to try and get it into a publishable state, and then with more practice you kind of get used to it a bit.
Yeah, definitely. It's the same with writing. It's a muscle. Like one of my recent clients, she did the microbook course, she undenied about it. She was told in college by an English teacher, you can't write and you'll never be able to write. And I would really like to punch that English teacher in the face. It's like, what kind of a person goes into teaching and then says that to somebody? Do you know what I mean?
That's so damaging.
Yeah. And so it was just like, don't be mean. Just don't be mean. And B, it's just not true. Like anybody can become a good writer if they practice enough. It's not, unless like there is a certain amount of natural talent with stuff like physical stuff. Like Michael Phelps is literally built to be an amazing swimmer, right? I'm never going to be able to swim like him, nor are you, nor is most, like 99.9% of people, because we are not physically built like he is. But like leaving all of that aside, leaving like the top 0.1% aside, anybody can become really good at something if they practice it. And so if you never start, then you're definitely never going to become good at it.
What she maybe could have said was, you're unlikely to be the next Stephen King. However,
don't let that stop you.
Don't let that stop you.
Yeah, exactly. And who's to say she'd want it to be the next bloody Stephen King anyway? It's like, and that's another thing. It's like people thinking, oh, I'm never going to be the next Stephen King. It's like, no, you're going to be the next you. And that's the other thing, is like, yes, when we learn to write, like I've done a lot of emulating other writers. Like I love David Sedaris, I love Maya Angelou, I love Toni Morrison, I love all the writers like that, and I will rewrite stuff in their style, and because that's how we learn what our own voice is. But ultimately I don't want to write like any of them, because I will be a pale and crappy imitation of them. I want to write as good as I possibly can, whatever good means. And so I think that's a useful thing for people to take away as well.
Well, that's the magical thing about writing and publishing, is it is kind of snapping shut on like a butterfly almost, that you're kind of framing for future. So it's like having a butterfly in a book that you preserved, and someone can open that book in the future and look at that and get the message and get the voice that was in your head at that time. So it's almost like you're time traveling to different places and scaling what you have to say, which is kind of the whole point of this, surely, is scaling your impacts and helping more people and delivering a positive change to your corner of the world, in whatever that looks like. And surely that's what we're here to do.
That's what I think so. Yeah, I think so. I have heard writing described as time travel before, and I think it's a really good way of doing it. It's like you can, you'll be able to reach people hundreds of years in the future. We're still reading stuff that's thousands of years old, and that, like, it boggles me to think that when the people who wrote it, I bet they did not think there would be people reading it in thousands of years. And I would love to see their faces now when they're like, what? People are like still what? And it's really boggling. So yeah, I think it's about leaving that impact, and it's about getting your story out and your point of view, and being able, and especially now that we've kind of democratized publishing a little bit and we can self-publish, it's like there aren't gatekeepers anymore. And that's a good thing, because traditionally publishers have a very fixed idea of who they want to publish, and it's changing slowly, but like we've got all of these different voices now whose stories need to be told. And I'm going to use Prince Harry as an example, not because he's underprivileged, because he most definitely isn't, but people have been like ragging on him because he's released his autobiography, right? his memoir. Like, I don't blame him at all, because he's spent the whole of his life having the media tell God knows what lies about him and telling his story for him. And so he has been screaming into the void. He's been, he's been spent his time trying desperately to tell his story. Nobody has listened. So he's like, you know what, fuck it. I'm going to write my story in my book. And he's extremely privileged and all the rest of it. But I can't imagine what it must be like to be somebody of whatever privilege having your voice taken away, because that is what the media did to him.
It's his prerogative to do that.
Exactly.
And, if people want to read it, then that,
and then you think about all of the other people who don't have all of his advantages, and all of the people whose voices traditionally haven't been heard, like, writers of color, Black writers, people from the LGBT community,
people who would never ever get a book publishing contract under a for perhaps going a bit further back in time, but it would have been very difficult.
Yeah, and like I say, things are changing, not fast enough, but those people all now have access to get their stories out there and get their stories heard, and have other people, like, it's an empathy thing, right? We can't understand what we can't see, and we can't care about what we don't understand. So it's that, when you're talking about making a positive impact on the world, that's what I'm thinking about, is like, how do we leave the world a little bit better than when we started? How do we leave it with a little bit more kindness? And I think the way to do that is storytelling, and I think the best way to do that is books, because they last.
And empathy is the entire basis of storytelling. I mean, there's quite a lot of fiction authors who say that when they really get involved into writing a work of fiction, and you get in the heads of your characters, it makes you a little bit better at understanding other people, because you started off by understanding yourself on a deeper and more fundamental level, and that in itself is probably a reason to write.
100%. Yeah, I don't think most people spend much time at all digging into their own psyches and their own who they are. I think more people in our space will, because I think entrepreneurs tend to be a little bit more self-reflective, but like, people just don't, like, they're too busy, they're too selfish, they're too whatever. And I'm trying not to be judgy about it, but like, as soon as you start digging into writing a book, it's exactly like you say, you have to become more self-aware, and that means looking at your own biases and your own the habits and all of that stuff that goes with it. And that starts to make you look outwards and think, okay, so where could I do better in the world? Where am I doing damage in the world? Where can I understand? Like, just start with, where can I understand that person better? And kind of digging in, and not telling other people's stories for them, but digging in and figuring out and reading their stories is a really good place to start.
I wanted to go back to the democratization of publishing. So are you using Amazon KDP, or how are you getting people's books out into the world?
So I find the whole process extremely onerous, so I don't do that for people. I kind of show them where to start. But I have got some stuff on Amazon KDP, but I really like using Ingram Spark. So Ingram is one of the world's biggest book distributors anyway, and Ingram Spark is their online self-publishing, and they distribute to everybody, including Amazon, and so they'll get it out all over the place. So I like to use Ingram partly because I like to do things once rather than twice. I don't need to do it for Amazon if I've done it for Ingram, and partly because I would like to rely a bit less on Amazon, and again, I know that not everybody has that luxury, and I know a lot of people's livelihoods depend on Amazon, so I'm certainly not, I'm not saying don't do it or being judgy about it, but like, I would like to use Amazon less. So for me, that's Ingram Spark is a really good way of doing it. And there are other platforms now as well that are coming up. There's bookshop.org, which is, I buy as many books as I can from there now. And there's also, Ingram Spark will distribute to bricks and mortar bookshops as well and make it available. And there are ways that, if you build relationships with local bookshops and things like that, that's a really good way to start getting your self-published books out into the world. And I think as well, because there are so many self-published books now, traditional publishing is going to become less and less important. It's becoming more of a vanity thing rather than a kind of mark of credibility or whatever. And so I think it's going to become easier to get your book. I don't think that's true. It's not going to become easier to get your book into bookstores, because I don't think it's ever been easy to do that. But I do think it'll become more of a level playing field, and that traditional books will be less likely to be given a lot of weight over self-published books. So I think there'll just be more opportunities for people.
I mean, I guess bookshops will sell whatever people want to buy.
Exactly. Yeah.
It doesn't actually matter who's published it or where it's come from. I also realized going through this with my own book that there's a lot of people who specialize in the various parts of the publishing process that I maybe do not want to deal with. I'm not very good at. Like, I'm not a great line editor. I don't really do typesetting very well. I can do all of these things, but probably shouldn't. Cover design, I can get version 0.1 up for you really quickly, but you don't really want to use it forever. Actually, there's because independent publishing has become quite a real thing. There's various people who specialize in these things, and you can kind of leverage that, I guess.
Yeah, there's so many people doing so many amazing things. So like I use a piece of software called Vellum to typeset my books. So it's available only on the Mac, but like if people are listening and they're like, oh, I want to write more than one book, it might be worth investing in Vellum because do 2 books and it will have paid for itself in terms of paying somebody else to do the typesetting. Does basic stuff. So basic is kind of standard stuff. If you want anything fancy typesetting wise, lots of images, that kind of thing, go to a professional typesetter. But yeah, there are also people who will, do all of the getting your book up onto the distribution centers. So like Ingram Spark or Amazon, there are people who will help you do that. There are cover designers all over the place. There are some great ones on Fiverr as well. I know people are a bit snotty about Fiverr, but there are some great cover designers on Fiverr. There are also some great cover designers off Fiverr. There's typesetters, there's, like you say, line editors. I really use Pro Writing Aid a lot. It's like a Grammarly, but different version. That's really great. Like if you're on a tight budget, at the very least, invest in something like Pro Writing Aid or Grammarly and make sure that works. And now we've got AI tools as well. I think they're going to be people are going to be using those as well for things like proofreading and line editing. And so there's some really interesting developments coming out in terms of technology that people will be able to use as well.
So this is my last question. So obviously there's ChatGPT seems to have burst onto the scene in the last, to me, in the last few weeks. And I know that that's not the case. I just don't pay that much attention to these things. But it was noteworthy to me that all of a sudden various people in completely different fields, not marketing related, were talking about it. And I thought, well, that probably means there's something worth paying attention to. And I wondered, perhaps not even specific to ChatGPT, but that kind of technology, what role do you kind of foresee it playing?
So this is, I find this really interesting. There's been a lot of outrage about it, and I find outrage extremely boring because it's not very thoughtful. I'm not going to touch on kind of the grey area of the ethics of taking art that's already out there and kind of creating something else from it.
Because it's an assimilation tool, I guess.
Yeah, because I don't really know enough about that, and I'm not going to talk about it. But in terms of a tool for writers, I think it's super useful because certainly for me, like if I start researching something, like I started researching George Orwell and ended up knowing almost everything you can possibly know about whirlpools. Don't even ask how, but that's like my research process. It's interesting, but it's really frustrating if I want to get something done quickly. And I think that ChatGPT and AIs like that will just be really useful because I just ask it questions and it will provide, you don't have to go looking, you don't have to disappear down a YouTube wormhole.
Because ChatGPT will go down the rabbit holes instantly and return something vaguely sensible to you that will shortcut that process.
Exactly, yeah. And like I would say to people, treat it like Wikipedia, treat it as a place to start. Like don't treat it as gospel because it's not necessarily going to be totally 100% correct. But like, yeah, use it for research, use it as a starting point. So like if you're like, oh, I want to write a book about emus, for example, it's like ChatGPT, tell me 10 things about emus. That can be a really good place to start. And so those 10 things, and then tell me 10 more, and then tell me 10 more. And it's like, that's going to spark off ideas. So it's like an idea generation thing. It's not going to write its thing for you, although I'm sure we will see lots of books written by AIs. And I know people have been kind of, AI is going to steal our jobs. It's like, that's been the thing ever since industrialization. So I'm not particularly worried about that. But my other thought on it was, you know what? If an AI can write a sales page better than I can, let it get on with it. Because that to me is like, why would I waste my time doing it when I could then create something human? Because I think this is the thing that people have a profound misunderstanding about, right? With creation and art and things that we create, because I do see all writing, including copywriting, as art. It's like, if you tell an AI to create something, it will create it and it'll probably do a really good job and like it'll paint a beautiful landscape, whatever. But that to me is boring because I'm like, why that landscape? Why did the painter choose to paint that thing? Why did the writer choose to write this story? And that to me is what's really interesting, is like the human story.
It's the caption under the picture, almost as the picture.
It is, yeah. It's the reason below it. And so like, yes, it can be beautiful and all the rest of it, but I think subconsciously, and again, most people don't think about this consciously, but subconsciously, it's not the painting that we're interested in, it's the human story behind it. And so we can kind of look at that painting and think, oh, Edvard Munch painted the Scream. It's like, God, what kind of a mindset must he have been in to paint that picture, And it just sends you down that really interesting rabbit hole. It's like Van Gogh and his like ear phase. It's like all of that stuff. And AI is just, it can't do that because it doesn't, all it has is the parameters that we give it. And so for me, that kind of art is not, it's never going to be as interesting, you know, it's not, and if it does get to the point where it's sentient, then it becomes interesting, because then it's like, well, it's going to have its own reasons for doing so, and that in itself becomes interesting. Either that, or we're all totally fucked because robots have taken over the world. Who knows? So
didn't they make a film about that once?
I think they did. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Skynet.
yeah, something like that.
The Matrix. Yeah. So yeah, that's my thoughts about how AI can be used in a nutshell.
So your role in your business is to be human, because AI is not human. Ultimately it's computational. So anything that is computational should probably be done by AI when the tools are available. But that shifts your availability, your headspace to higher value work of being authentic, being you, communicating, deciding fundamentally what your message is and who you stand for. And like, as far as I'm concerned, like I don't see currently how AI can really tell your story. Like, I think it has to come from you.
It can give you a start. It can give you a place to start, and can give you some ideas. And that, as at the moment, is as far as it can go. And I think that's really useful, because I think it's going to be a really useful tool in helping people to get over that blank page hump that they often get to. It's like suddenly you're not faced with a blank page, you're faced with some information that AI has pulled out, and then you get to take that and do something interesting with it. And that's where it becomes interesting. It's like exactly what you said. It frees us up to do the higher value work, and it forces us, it pushes us as humans to become more interesting and to become more human and to evolve in whatever direction we evolve in. And I think that is a good thing. I don't think that we should be just wanting to churn out this, like there's enough robotic shit churned out by humans as it is already. So like, if you're worried about AI taking your job, then my suggestion would be become more fucking interesting. Yeah,
and I think I remember Sean D'Souza saying years ago that even if there's like 100 other people doing what you do, like people want to hear from you, people want your take on it, people want your perspective, people want to hear your experience.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. And that's where, that's where the generic advice that an AI can throw out is going to fall down, because like I just Googled the other day, tell me about writing tips for people with ADHD. And it threw out a bunch of ideas. And then from there, I'm writing my own experience, because like they want to hear how, what I've done, the things that I've struggled with, the wormhole, how I ended up knowing about whirlpools when I started off with George Orwell. That's the kind of, that's the kind of thing that people are going to resonate with. It's like, if you just give people facts, that's boring. We're back to story again, right? We're back to telling a story, and why did this happen, and where has it gone, and how do we get people to relate? Because people will read that. Like I love memes. Like memes are a really good example. Like memes are a really good form of communication, because I look at so many memes like,
I've spent most of the last 2 years sending memes around, so I can relate to that.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. It's like, this is how I communicate with one of my best friends who also has ADHD. It's just like me. It's like I will read them and I'm like, oh my God, that like perfectly describes what's going on in my head. And it's that connection. And so, it can be really short form or it can be longer form, but it has to be personal, and it has to be from you.
I have 2 thoughts, so we're pretty much out of time, but I kind of think we should convert the transcript of this episode into a microbook, or at least look at it, because I think that'd be really interesting.
Yeah.
And then secondly, how can people find out more about your work? How can people follow you? Maybe subscribe to your email list?
Oh, I would love people to subscribe to my email list. They can go to moxiebooks.co.uk, and there are sign-up links all over the place. But if you go to /notes in the margin, that's my email sign up. I am Tiny Beetle Steps on Instagram and Twitter. I am on LinkedIn as Vicky Quinn Fraser Book Coach, I think. If you Google my name, you'll find me. And yeah, best place to start really is with my book. My big book at the moment, but I've got various microbooks coming out, so keep an eye out for those.
So Moxie Books is MOXIE.
Yes.
Books.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, I'll make sure we put links to all of those things in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Great. Well, I think this has been a great conversation. So thanks for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been lots of fun.